At the beginning of the 20th century, motion pictures were a developing commercial novelty. By the early 1920s, they had become one of the most widely consumed forms of entertainment in the United States. Millions of Americans attended the movies each week. Film had evolved from short, experimental attractions into feature-length narratives distributed on a national scale. The production code, often associated with the 1930s and 1940s, did not emerge suddenly or without precedent. It developed from more than a decade of industrial growth, public controversy, legal rulings, and organized reform movements. This episode examines the period from roughly 1905 through the mid-1920s to understand why pressure for censorship intensified and why the American film industry ultimately chose self-regulation over government control. In the early 1900s, films were primarily shown in nickelodeons, small storefront theaters that charged 5 cents per admission. These venues proliferated rapidly in urban areas, particularly in working-class neighborhoods. Nickelodeons were significant because they were inexpensive and accessible. Unlike legitimate theater, which was often associated with middle and upper-class audiences, film exhibition required neither high ticket prices nor formal dress. It also required minimal literacy. For immigrant communities and laborers, motion pictures offered entertainment that transcended language barriers. Nickelodeons themselves were usually modest spaces. Many operated in converted storefronts or former retail shops and seated anywhere from 50 to a few hundred people. Programs ran continuously throughout the day, allowing patrons to enter at any time and stay as long as they wished. A typical program included several short films accompanied by live music, often played on a piano or small theater organ. Because admission was inexpensive and the films were visually driven, Nickelodeons attracted a wide range of audiences. Workers could attend after long shifts, children could stop in after school, and newly arrived immigrants could enjoy stories that required little knowledge of English. For many people, the movies became a regular part of daily urban life. However, the rapid spread of Nickelodeons also raised concerns among reformers. Critics argued that the theaters were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and unsupervised. Some worried that young audiences were spending long hours in dark rooms watching stories that might promote crime, romance, or rebellion. Although these concerns were often exaggerated, they helped establish the idea that motion pictures might require oversight. By 1910, thousands of Nickelodeons operated across the United States. As the 1910s progressed, feature-length films replaced short subjects, and large movie palaces were constructed in major cities. By the early 1920s, weekly movie attendance had reached into the tens of millions. One early example of cinema's narrative and commercial potential was The Great Train Robbery. The film dramatized outlaw violence and famously concluded with a bandit firing a revolver directly at the audience. Although brief, the image demonstrated the medium's ability to create emotional immediacy. Reformers would later argue that this immediacy made film uniquely powerful and potentially dangerous. By the mid-1910s, film production had become increasingly centralized in California. Studios developed vertically integrated systems controlling production, distribution, and exhibition. The star system emerged, turning actors into nationally recognized celebrities through fan magazines and publicity campaigns. A pivotal moment in early film history was The Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith. Technically ambitious and commercially successful, the film also generated widespread protest for its racist depiction of Reconstruction and its glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. The controversy surrounding the film led to bans and censorship in several cities. The incident demonstrated two things. First, that film could influence national conversations about race and politics, and second, that local governments were willing to intervene when content was deemed harmful. Opposition to the film was organized and sustained. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, launched campaigns in multiple cities to prevent the movie from being screened. Activists distributed pamphlets, organized protests, and appealed to municipal authorities to ban the film. Demonstrations occurred outside theaters in cities including Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia. In some locations, censorship boards ordered cuts or prohibited screenings altogether. While supporters of the film defended it as historical drama, critics argued that its imagery reinforced racist stereotypes and glorified the Ku Klux Klan. The controversy surrounding The Birth of a Nation demonstrated the growing cultural power of motion pictures. A single film had generated national debate, political pressure, and organized protest. For reformers who were already skeptical of the new medium, this event confirmed their belief that movies could shape public opinion in powerful and potentially dangerous ways. By the late 1910s, Hollywood was no longer a regional entertainment industry. It was shaping national culture. That scale of influence attracted scrutiny. Silent-era films addressed themes that reflected modern social change: urbanization, shifting gender roles, crime, and romantic independence. The vamp archetype, embodied by performers such as Theda Bara in A Fool There Was, presented a sexually assertive woman who exerted control over men. Although the film ultimately portrays moral consequences, critics focused on the character's overt sexuality and power. Crime films also became popular. Stories centered on bootleggers, thieves, and corrupt officials appeared throughout the 1910s and 1920s. While many narratives punished criminal behavior by the conclusion, reformers emphasized that the depiction of criminal techniques and glamorous lifestyles might encourage imitation. It is important to note that most silent-era films were not explicit by later standards. However, the combination of visual immediacy, growing audience size, and sensational marketing led some observers to argue that cinema was normalizing vice.
Say, why don't you put your foot where it belongs?
Don't encourage me.
These criticisms were often anecdotal rather than grounded in systematic research, but they gained traction in public discourse. Before a national code existed, censorship operated at the local and state levels. Beginning in the 1900s and expanding during the 1910s, several cities and states established official censorship boards. These boards reviewed films before exhibition and could require cuts or deny approval entirely. Scenes involving sexuality, childbirth, interracial relationships, religious irreverence, and criminal detail were frequently targeted. For national distributors, this patchwork system created logistical and financial challenges. Multiple versions of a single film often had to be prepared to satisfy regional standards. The authority of these boards was reinforced in 1915 when the United States Supreme Court ruled in Mutual Film Corporation v. Industrial Commission of Ohio that motion pictures were not protected under the First Amendment. The court characterized film as a business rather than an art form and concluded that states could regulate it through prior restraint. This ruling established that film censorship was constitutionally permissible. The decision would remain in effect until 1952. Public criticism intensified in the early 1920s following a series of highly publicized scandals involving film industry figures. In 1921, actor Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was charged with manslaughter after the death of actress Virginia Rappe following a party in San Francisco. Although Arbuckle was acquitted after 3 trials, much of the press coverage emphasized sensational allegations. Editorial commentary frequently portrayed Hollywood as morally corrupt. In 1922, director William Desmond Taylor was found murdered in Los Angeles. The case involved rumors of drug use and personal relationships and remained unsolved. These incidents reinforced existing anxieties about celebrity excess. Newspapers capitalized on scandal to increase circulation, and Hollywood became a symbol of perceived moral decline. While misconduct was not unique to the film industry, national visibility amplified its impact. The Arbuckle case became one of the first major media scandals of the modern celebrity era. Newspapers across the country published daily updates about the investigation and the trials that followed. Many reports relied on rumor or speculation, but the constant coverage helped shape the public image of Hollywood as a place of excess and moral irresponsibility. Other incidents during the same period reinforced this perception. In 1923, popular film actor Wallace Reid died following complications related to morphine addiction. Reid had originally been prescribed the drug after an injury during film production, but his death was widely reported as another example of the dangers of the Hollywood lifestyle. Fan magazines and newspapers had already helped create the modern star system, turning actors into nationally recognized public figures. As a result, the personal behaviors of performers became a matter of public interest. Critics argued that the movie stars served as role models for millions of fans, particularly young audiences. Whether these concerns were justified or exaggerated, the scandals intensified calls for reform. Religious organizations, civic groups, and political leaders increasingly argued that the film industry required stronger moral oversight. Throughout the 1920s, reformers frequently linked film content to juvenile delinquency. When young offenders committed crimes, newspapers sometimes reported that they had been inspired by movies. Empirical research on media effects was limited during this period. Nevertheless, the concept of imitation became central to censorship arguments. Religious organizations and civic groups organized campaigns encouraging parents to monitor their children's movie attendance. Sermons and pamphlets warned of moral decline. Framing censorship as protection for children proved especially persuasive. Even individuals who valued artistic freedom were often reluctant to oppose measures described as safeguarding youth. By the early 1920s, the American film industry faced a complicated situation. Movies had become one of the most profitable and influential forms of mass entertainment in the country, yet the industry was under increasing scrutiny from reform organizations, religious leaders, and government officials. Local censorship boards were already reviewing films across the United States, and additional regulation seemed increasingly possible. Some critics even proposed the creation of a national censorship authority that would review films before release. Studio executives recognized that government control could threaten both their creative authority and their financial interests. As a result, many industry leaders began to consider whether voluntary self-regulation might offer a practical solution. By 1922, studio executives recognized that continued scandal, negative publicity, and inconsistent censorship posed risks to profitability. In response, leading companies formed the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, or MPPDA. The organization sought to improve public relations and demonstrate that the industry could regulate itself responsibly. Studios hoped that voluntary standards would prevent federal intervention and reduce the unpredictability of local censorship. To lead the organization, studios appointed Will H. Hayes, a former U.S. Postmaster General with political experience and national credibility. Hayes' primary function was diplomatic and administrative. He reassured civic leaders and government officials that the industry was committed to reform. Under his leadership, the MPPDA issued guidelines discouraging explicit sexual content, ridicule of religion, and excessive violence. In 1927, these principles were formalized in a list known as the Don'ts and Be Carefuls. Although enforcement mechanisms remained weak during the 1920s, the establishment of centralized oversight marked a significant shift. The industry had acknowledged that unrestricted content posed economic and political risks. By the mid-1920s, several developments had converged. Film had become a national mass medium. Local censorship boards operated with legal authority. The Supreme Court had denied film's constitutional protection. Scandals had damaged Hollywood's reputation. Religious and civic organizations were organized and influential. And the industry had begun to experiment with self-regulation. The production code would emerge formally in 1930 and would become strictly enforced beginning in 1934. But its origins lie in this earlier period, in legal vulnerability, public controversy, economic calculation, and moral reform activism. Understanding this context clarifies that film censorship in the United States was not simply imposed from the outside. It was negotiated between industry leaders, reformers, courts, and audiences. In the next episode, we will examine how early voluntary guidelines developed into the production code, and how enforcement reshaped American filmmaking for more than 3 decades.